The tension between us was undeniable. What I once appreciated about Brad's analytical mindset now felt like a barrier. He approached every conversation like a problem to solve, focusing on solutions, while I sought dialogue and exploration. Hey, I'm Brad, and let me tell you, planning the perfect proposal is a wild ride, something no one prepares you for. It's not just about getting a ring and popping the question, it's about creating a moment that reflects everything your relationship represents. Naomi and I had been together for 4 years, long enough to know each other deeply, but still uncovering new layers. We first met during grad school. I was studying environmental engineering, and she was diving into business analytics. From the beginning, I was drawn to her laser sharp focus, while others grabbed coffee and made small talk. Naomi was already solving complex data problems like they were nothing. Our first date wasn't exactly romantic. It was at a campus sustainability conference, of all places. I was presenting research on urban water management, and she was representing a consulting firm focused on sustainable business practices. After my presentation, she approached me, not with compliments or small talk, but with a sharp critique of my methods. While others might have been offended, I was fascinated. Her passion and candor were refreshing. That critique turned into a 3 hour coffee chat where we talked about everything: climate change, corporate ethics, and our dreams. By the end of that conversation, I knew she wasn't just someone I could date, she was a partner for life. Planning the proposal consumed my thoughts for months. As a guy who thrives on spreadsheets and practical plans, this felt like uncharted territory. I researched endlessly, sought advice from her best friend, discreetly, of course, and considered every possible scenario. The hiking trail wasn't just a random choice, it symbolized our relationship: demanding, rewarding, and always revealing something new. We'd walked that trail many times, and the overlook I picked wasn't just beautiful, it held meaning. It was the spot where we'd had our first deep conversation about long term goals and realized how aligned our visions for the future were. I chose the ring with the same care I'd apply to an engineering project. It wasn't flashy, no oversized gems screaming for attention. Instead, it was an elegant platinum band with a conflict free diamond reflecting Naomi's values: ethical, understated, and meaningful. The morning of the proposal, I was a wreck. A guy who could confidently present complex environmental models was suddenly shaking at the thought of asking one question. I packed everything meticulously: her favorite deli sandwiches, those chocolate chip cookies she loved, and enough water for the hike. The hike itself was like any other we'd done, a mix of work talk, goofy jokes, and moments of quiet. Naomi was discussing a challenging project, her usual intensity shining through. She had no idea what was coming. When we reached the overlook, everything felt perfect. The mountain breeze was soft, the sunlight filtered through the trees, and the panoramic view was as breathtaking as ever. I waited until she took a bite of her sandwich, partly for comic timing, partly because I knew she'd be caught off guard. "Naomi," I said, dropping to one knee, "you're the best partner I could ever imagine. Will you marry me?" Her reaction was pure joy, a loud yes, happy tears, and a smile so bright it felt like it could light up a city. But then she added a condition: a 2 year wait before marriage to ensure we were financially and professionally on equal footing. In that moment, I was reminded of everything I loved about her: thoughtful, strategic, and committed to her vision. It wasn't a delay, it was a calculated step forward. I'm Naomi Rodriguez, and if there's one thing my 28 years have taught me, is that life rarely follows a straightforward path. The day Brad proposed was supposed to be simple, joyful, and clear, but nothing is ever that easy, especially for someone like me, whose life revolves around strategic thinking. I come from a family of first generation professionals. My parents immigrated from Mexico, juggling multiple jobs to give my brother and me the chance to pursue higher education. Their sacrifices weren't lost on me. Every milestone I achieved, academic or professional, felt like a win for the entire family. That background instilled in me the understanding that success isn't just personal, it's about creating sustainable pathways for others. When Brad proposed, my initial reaction was excitement. The location was perfect, our favorite hiking trail, a place that represented our shared love for challenges and growth. But as the joy settled, I couldn't help but think practically. Marriage wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a major life decision with serious personal and financial implications. My career in business analytics had trained me to approach big decisions with careful analysis. A wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a shift in priorities, requiring careful planning. The 2-year wait wasn't a rejection of Brad or our relationship, it was a deliberate pause. I wanted to solidify my position at the consulting firm, aim for a major promotion, and ensure we had a strong financial foundation. Brad's engineering career was steady, but I was in a critical growth phase. Many of the professional women I admired had stressed the importance of building an independent identity before combining personal and professional lives. During this time, I stumbled across online communities, exploring unconventional views on marriage. I didn't fully adopt the ideas of the marriage resistance movement, but it sparked fascinating conversations about traditional relationship dynamics. These spaces were filled with stories from professional women whose experiences mirrored my own. Stories of women prioritizing career growth, challenging societal norms, and reimagining relationships beyond traditional frameworks fascinated me. These women weren't anti love, they championed personal empowerment. One online forum thread particularly stood out to me, discussing marriage as a potential patriarchal construct. It made me question my own motivations. Was I subconsciously following a societal script? My background in data analysis kicked in, prompting me to explore marriage through historical and sociological lenses. I discovered that marriage wasn't solely a romantic institution, but a complex social and economic arrangement that had transformed significantly over centuries. For women in professional fields like mine, marriage historically signified dependence, but now we had choices. Hmm. Brad's initial understanding of these nuanced perspectives was limited. While his support for the 2-year delay felt sincere, it seemed more like a practical concession than an ideological alignment. As I delved deeper into alternative narratives, I grew conflicted. My love for Brad was undeniable, but I started to question whether traditional marriage was the best structure for us. Could we redefine our partnership to transcend conventional expectations? Conversations within my professional network added another layer to my reflections. Many successful women I admired embraced diverse relationship models. Some were traditionally married, others were in long term partnerships without legal ties, and some chose independent lives. Each choice was valid, deeply personal, and inspiring. For me, this wasn't about rejecting Brad or love. It was about crafting a relationship that honored both individual growth and mutual partnership. I wanted a marriage free from outdated gender roles or societal pressures. The marriage resistance communities offered ideas that felt liberating, not about rejecting love, but about reimagining it. They challenged the notion of marriage as the ultimate goal, emphasizing autonomy, mutual respect, and the continuous negotiation of terms. As weeks turned to months, my perspective began to shift. What if marriage wasn't a fixed destination, but an evolving process? What if our engagement was an opportunity to design a partnership rooted in equality? Brad remained patient and supportive, but I could sense a growing gap between us. My evolving ideas challenged the traditional future he envisioned. My questions became sharper, my critiques more systemic. I didn't realize how much these thoughts would test the foundation of our relationship. The 2-year delay we had agreed upon was no longer a simple matter of timing, it had grown into something far more intricate. There's always a moment when you realize something fundamental is changing in a relationship. For me, it wasn't dramatic, but a slow, almost unnoticeable drift that started after our engagement. Naomi had always been articulate and passionate, but her conversations began taking on a different tone. What once felt like casual commentary about societal structures began sounding like deliberate critiques. As an engineer, I'm naturally systematic and analytical. I prefer understanding situations before reacting to them. My first instinct was to listen and try to grasp the nuances of her shifting perspectives. And our first major conversation happened during a weekend brunch at our favorite minimalist cafe with concrete floors and hanging plants. Naomi was in the middle of discussing a podcast that argued marriage was an outdated social construct. It's essentially an economic transaction wrapped in romantic packaging, she said, stirring her latte with more force than usual. I remember thinking, this is more than an intellectual exercise for her. I responded carefully. Every social institution evolves. Marriage has changed a lot over the decades. Doesn't that suggest it can keep adapting? I wanted to engage meaningfully, to show her I was listening and processing her ideas. But something about her approach had shifted. Our once balanced discussions now felt like she was presenting arguments designed to challenge rather than explore. Her language had become more academic, filled with sociological jargon that felt distancing instead of connecting. I'm not a traditionalist by nature. My work in environmental engineering requires me to question established systems and look for more efficient, equitable solutions. So, when Naomi started questioning marriage, I didn't dismiss her outright. I respected her intelligence too much for that. But respect didn't mean agreement. Over time, I became increasingly aware of the growing disconnect between us. Our communication shifted subtly. Where we once shared daily details naturally, our conversations now felt like staged debates. Naomi would introduce frameworks about partnership and gender dynamics, while I would listen, respond, and try to find common ground. It's not about rejecting you, she'd say. It's about redefining what partnership can mean. I understood the intellectual argument, but for me, partnership wasn't theoretical, it was lived. It meant mutual support, shared goals, and intentional togetherness. My patience wasn't limitless. I'm a practical person, not passive. Engineering has taught me that systems require understanding and strategic action. As Naomi's rhetoric became more absolute, I realized we were reaching a crossroads. One evening, after an intense discussion, I said, I hear what you're saying, but I need you to hear me too. Marriage, for me, isn't a patriarchal trap. It's a conscious commitment, a choice to build something meaningful together. I wasn't trying to change her mind. I was clarifying my own position. The distance between us wasn't just about differing opinions. It was about fundamentally different perspectives. Naomi was unraveling the concept of marriage while I was holding firm to my vision of partnership. Both views were deeply rooted in conviction. I admired her intellectual intensity, but I was also resolute about what I wanted. For me, marriage wasn't a tradition I upheld blindly. It was a deliberate act of commitment, one I couldn't compromise on. My approach was systematic: listen intently, understand fully, and respond with honesty. If our core values were truly incompatible, I was ready to face that painful truth. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly our carefully maintained equilibrium would start to fall apart. Professional growth is rarely a straight line, and the shift from a straightforward engagement to a deep re examination of partnership was no exception for me. The change wasn't abrupt, but rather a gradual, deliberate deconstruction of everything I thought I understood about relationships. The online communities I stumbled upon became more than casual browsing. They turned into intellectual hubs, challenging every preconceived notion I held about marriage. These weren't radical outliers, they were nuanced, thoughtful discussions led by sociologists, academics, and professional women who analyzed relationships with the same rigor I applied to market research. Armed with my training in business analytics, I approached these forums methodically, treating each argument as a data point, each perspective as a hypothesis to test. What emerged from these discussions wasn't a rejection of love, but a reframing of what partnership could be. Marriage, as I began to see it, wasn't a romantic ideal, but a complicated social agreement with power structures deeply ingrained within it. When I shared these ideas with Brad, my tone became increasingly analytical. It's not about you, I'd explain. It's about understanding the broader systems that shape our personal decisions. He listened with patience, but also with growing unease. Where I saw critical analysis of institutions, he felt a personal challenge to our relationship. Meanwhile, my professional circle validated many of the thoughts I was exploring. Women in consulting, tech, and academia shared similar experiences, conversations about rethinking traditional relationship structures while maintaining meaningful connections. One online thread about marriage as a patriarchal construct particularly resonated with me. It included stories of how conventional marriage had limited professional growth for women, presenting a larger systemic issue I was determined to understand. The deeper I delved into these narratives, the more complex my perspective became. I wasn't advocating for the elimination of marriage, but for a reimagining of its structure. I envisioned a partnership as a dynamic, evolving agreement that prioritized mutual respect and individual growth. Yet, Brad's perspective embodied a more traditional narrative. His love for me was sincere, but it was also rooted in conventional expectations. When I challenged those, I could see his confusion and, at times, subtle resistance. We can create something different, I'd argue. A partnership that doesn't rely on outdated scripts. My arguments were never emotional. They were meticulously researched, supported by data, sociological studies, and personal observations. I presented them as if they were a business strategy, complete with context and alternative models. But the tension was undeniable. Brad's engineering mindset, which I had once admired, now felt like an obstacle. He approached our discussions like problems to solve, looking for closure, while I sought continuous dialogue and discovery. Our conversations turned into intellectual sparring matches, a careful balancing act of individual beliefs and systemic critiques. I was fully aware of the personal cost of this journey. Brad wasn't just my partner, he was someone I loved deeply, but I was beginning to understand that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a meaningful partnership. True connection required mutual respect, personal autonomy, and the ability to continuously redefine our relationship. These were the values I found reflected in the marriage resistance communities. They offered alternatives to the traditional model, long term collaborations without legal ties, relationships built on mutual consent and renegotiation, partnerships that prioritized individual development over societal expectations. My professional identity was intertwined with this perspective. As a woman who had fought to build her career, whose parents had sacrificed so much for her opportunities, I couldn't accept a conventional narrative. Brad represented stability and the comfort of a well defined path. But I was no longer drawn to comfort. I wanted a partnership that was challenging, adaptive, and constantly evolving. The fear of losing myself was far greater. As our 2 year engagement unfolded, the distance between us grew more pronounced. What had begun as a strategic pause turned into a fundamental reassessment of our entire relationship. Our differences were no longer subtle, they were fundamental. When Brad finally broached the topic of ending our engagement, it wasn't with anger or dramatic accusations. It was a calm, measured conversation, almost like a professional debrief. "We want different things," he said simply, "and that's okay." His acceptance wasn't passive or indifferent. It was the kind of logical conclusion he might apply to an engineering project that no longer fit the original specifications. In that moment, I realized our love had been real, but love alone couldn't sustain a partnership without shared foundational values. When the end came, it wasn't a disaster. It was a recalibration of our individual paths, a recognition that we needed to grow separately.